If we secure this position, the rest of the island falls within the week.
What about the American fleet's projected arrival?
We assume they will be late.
Move those logs up, let's go!
Faster, watch the line!
Incoming, keep your heads down!
August 1942, Guadalcanal. Before dawn, the jungle is still wet from night rain. Steam rises slowly from torn earth. In the half-light, Japanese forward observers lie motionless at the tree line, watching an American perimeter that did not exist hours earlier. Yesterday, this ground was flat, exposed, a killing field waiting to be crossed. Now it is broken. Fresh trenches cut sharp lines across the soil. Fighting positions are already waist-deep. Machine gun nests sit low, invisible until they speak. Earth has been piled, shaped, and compacted with a speed that seems unreal in a place where every shovel strike should take minutes, not seconds. The observers exchange quiet looks. This is not how enemies are supposed to fight here. No reckless charges. No open ground. The Americans have turned time itself into cover. Somewhere behind the lines, engines idle. Bulldozers, brought ashore under fire, have already moved on to the next task. Combat engineers tighten revetments. Marines finish their foxholes with practiced movements learned long before they reach this island. By the time the sun breaks through the canopy, the ground has hardened into a weapon, and the shock felt by the watching Japanese soldiers is not fear, but confusion, because nothing in their doctrine prepared them for an enemy who could reshape the battlefield overnight. Long before American shovels cut into Pacific soil, the Imperial Japanese Army had already decided how this war would be fought. Its doctrine was forged decades earlier, in Manchuria, in China, in the frozen hills of the Russo-Japanese War. Victory, Japanese planners believed, came from spirit, speed, and decisive offensive action. The battlefield was not something to be shaped patiently. It was something to be seized, crossed, and overwhelmed through momentum and will. Japanese field manuals before the war emphasized movement over preparation. Defensive fortifications were seen as temporary measures, useful only when they supported an eventual counterattack. Deep trench systems, elaborate revetments, and layered defenses were considered signs of hesitation, habits of armies afraid to close with the enemy. Instead, Japanese units trained to advance light and fast. Soldiers carried minimal equipment. Heavy engineering tools were rare at the front. The assumption was simple: a battle would not last long enough to require extensive digging. If the enemy stalled, a night attack would break them. If resistance hardened, courage and shock would finish the job. This philosophy shaped expectations about opponents as well. Western armies, particularly Americans, were widely viewed through the lens of racial and cultural misjudgment. Japanese intelligence assessments before 1941 often described U.S. soldiers as technically skilled but mentally soft. They were believed to rely on comfort, heavy supply chains, and fixed positions that could be outflanked or shattered by aggressive assault. The idea that American infantry would dig quickly, methodically, and under fire did not fit this image. When Japan went to war in December 1941, early victories seemed to confirm every assumption. Hong Kong fell in weeks. Singapore, considered an impregnable fortress, collapsed in days. The Philippines crumbled under relentless pressure. Allied forces retreated again and again, often abandoning prepared positions before they could be fully used. Japanese officers drew clear conclusions. Speed worked. Shock worked. Enemies broke when pressed hard enough. In these campaigns, Japanese troops often encountered poorly coordinated defenses. Trenches, when found, were shallow. Positions lacked depth. In Malaya and the Philippines, many Allied units withdrew rather than stand and improve their ground. The lesson, as seen from Tokyo and field headquarters alike, was that offensive spirit outweighed engineering effort. This reinforced a dangerous certainty. By mid-1942, Japanese planners believed they understood the enemy's rhythm. Landings would be chaotic. Initial defenses would be thin. If attacked quickly, especially at night, American or Allied troops would either retreat or collapse. What they did not account for was the difference between unprepared colonial garrisons and a fully mobilized industrial army arriving with doctrine already tested in training. Japanese defensive thinking also lagged behind reality. Field fortifications, when built, were often linear and shallow. Camouflage and concealment were emphasized, but speed of construction was not. Earthworks were dug by hand, slowly, often only after contact with the enemy had already occurred. The assumption remained that terrain was fixed. Hills, jungles, and beaches were obstacles to move through, not materials to be reshaped. This mindset extended down to the individual soldier. Japanese infantry training focused heavily on marksmanship, bayonet work, endurance, and obedience. Entrenching tools were issued, but their use was limited. Digging was something done at night, cautiously, and usually shallow, foxholes rather than systems. The psychological dimension mattered just as much as the physical one. Japanese commanders believed that visible preparation signaled weakness. A soldier seen digging was a soldier thinking defensively. And defense, in the Imperial Army's culture, was something to endure briefly, not to perfect. By the time Japanese forces began consolidating their Pacific perimeter in 1942, these beliefs were deeply ingrained. They expected future battles to resemble past victories. Swift landings, brief resistance, decisive blows delivered before the enemy could organize. Then came places like Guadalcanal. There, for the first time, Japanese troops did not face an enemy retreating inland. They faced an enemy staying put, working the earth relentlessly, reshaping it hour by hour. And as Japanese observers watched American positions deepen with alarming speed, the gap between doctrine and reality began to widen. Quietly, dangerously, setting the stage for a confrontation not just of armies, but of philosophies. What Japanese planners could not see from across the Pacific was that American soldiers did not arrive at Guadalcanal or any Pacific beach unprepared to dig. They arrived expecting to. Long before the United States entered the war, its Army and Marine Corps had treated field fortification as a fundamental survival skill. Lessons from World War I had not been forgotten. American military schools taught that infantry without cover was infantry already half defeated. Time spent shaping the ground was not weakness, it was insurance. By the late 1930s, U.S. training manuals emphasized rapid entrenchment under combat conditions. Soldiers were taught that the first act after halting was to dig. Not later, not when ordered. Immediately. Even shallow earth, instructors stressed, could mean the difference between a wound and a body bag. This mindset was institutional, not improvised. Every American infantryman was issued an entrenching tool and drilled relentlessly in its use. Foxholes were standardized. Firing steps, grenade sumps, and drainage trenches were taught as muscle memory. Digging was timed. Units competed to see how fast positions could reach fighting depth. The Marine Corps went further. Anticipating amphibious warfare across the Pacific, Marine planners assumed landings would be followed by immediate counterattacks. Defensive works, therefore, had to appear almost instantly. Marines trained to dig while exhausted, while wet, and while under simulated fire. The expectation was clear: the enemy would not give time. Time had to be stolen from the earth itself. But the real difference, the one that shocked Japanese observers, lay behind the infantry. The United States did not view engineering as a support function. It viewed it as a combat arm. Army combat engineers were embedded with frontline units, trained not only to build but to fight. They carried rifles alongside explosives and shovels. Their mission was simple: turn terrain into advantage as fast as possible. Roads, trenches, revetments, and obstacles were all part of the same battle rhythm. Then there were the Seabees. Formed in early 1942, the naval construction battalions were unlike anything the Japanese military had faced. These were skilled civilian construction workers, carpenters, bulldozer operators, electricians, trained to build under fire. They landed with heavy equipment. They worked without hesitation, and they did not stop when shells fell. Bulldozers, graders, and earth movers appeared on beaches where Japanese planners believed only rifles would matter. In hours, landing zones became supply dumps. In days, airstrips rose from jungle and coral. And in the quiet spaces between attacks, trenches deepened with mechanical speed. This was not improvisation. It was industrial warfare applied to dirt. American logistics made it possible. Ships delivered not just men and ammunition, but tools in enormous quantity. Spare blades, fuel, replacement parts. Engineering units could afford to work fast because they knew more equipment was always coming. Equally important was command philosophy. American officers were encouraged to delegate. Small unit leaders were trusted to improve positions without waiting for orders. If a platoon halted, it dug. If a company expected contact, it fortified. There was no stigma attached to preparation. On the contrary, officers who failed to entrench were criticized. Reports from early Pacific battles repeatedly emphasized the value of field works. On Guadalcanal, Marines learned quickly that Japanese artillery and mortars were accurate and relentless. The response was not withdrawal, but deeper trenches, better cover, and overlapping fields of fire. The ground itself became part of the unit. This approach confused Japanese observers because it defied their expectations of tempo. Americans did not rush to attack. They absorbed pressure. They traded space for time. And in that time, they transformed exposed ground into defensive systems that multiplied their firepower. By the time Japanese assault units advanced, they often faced positions that looked permanent, though they had been built in hours. What appeared to be caution was, in fact, calculation. American doctrine assumed the enemy would attack repeatedly. The goal was not to win in a single charge, but to survive long enough for artillery, air power, and logistics to take effect. Every shovel of earth was part of that strategy. And so, when Japanese troops stared across newly scarred terrain, trenches deep, revetment strong, firing positions already integrated, they were not just witnessing engineering speed. They were encountering an enemy fighting a different kind of war, one where patience, preparation, and the quiet violence of digging could decide battles before the first assault ever began. That contrast between spirit and structure, between movement and method, would soon reveal itself from multiple angles, each exposing a different layer of the same shock. For the American infantryman, digging was not a task assigned after danger passed. It was something done while danger was still arriving. On islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and later Peleliu, soldiers dropped to their knees the moment they halted. Rifles were set within reach. Helmets were pulled low. Shovels struck earth in short, violent motions. Every second mattered. Japanese artillery and mortars did not wait for comfort. Shells came early, often inaccurately at first, but close enough to teach the lesson. Men learned quickly that even a few inches of dirt could save a life. A shallow scrape could turn shrapnel aside. A foxhole could muffle blast and noise just enough to keep a man fighting. This was exhausting work. The ground was rarely cooperative. Coral tore hands. Jungle roots resisted every strike. Rain filled holes as fast as they were dug. Yet the motion continued because it had been trained in a muscle memory. There was no heroism in standing tall. Survival lay low. Veterans later recalled how digging became instinctive. No orders were needed. New arrivals copied the motions of those already in place. Engineers moved among them, correcting angles, improving drainage, deepening walls. Japanese observers, accustomed to enemies who maneuvered or withdrew under pressure, saw something unfamiliar. Men who stayed put and worked while shells fell. It was not defiance. It was procedure, and it turned exposed troops into defenders faster than the attackers expected. Japanese doctrine often imagined defense as a thin line to be held briefly, then abandoned for counterattack. American doctrine envisioned something else entirely. Depth. American positions were rarely single trenches. Even when time was limited, layouts followed a pattern. Forward foxholes, secondary positions behind them, and fallback points integrated into the terrain. Machine guns were placed not to dominate one direction, but to overlap fields of fire. Mortar pits were dug low and masked. Command posts were buried deeper still. This layering mattered. When Japanese units attacked, they often struck what appeared to be the main line, only to discover that fire continued from behind, from the flanks, from positions they had not seen. Trenches absorbed shock. Men rotated between positions. Units did not collapse when one section was hit. Defense by depth also allowed Americans to absorb casualties without losing cohesion. If a forward position was overrun or damaged, the next one was already waiting. Time played a central role here. Every hour without attack meant deeper trenches, better cover, more coordination. American forces understood that even small delays worked in their favor. Japanese assaults, built around speed and shock, depended on catching defenders unprepared. When preparation had already happened, when depth already existed, the psychological edge dulled. The ground no longer belonged to the attacker. It resisted. What made this speed truly shocking was not just discipline. It was equipment. The American entrenching tool was small, but it was standardized, durable, and always present. Every soldier had one. Every soldier knew how to use it. That alone accelerated the first phase of digging. But behind the infantry came something unprecedented in jungle warfare. Bulldozers. Japanese troops had rarely encountered heavy, earth-moving machinery near the front. American forces brought them ashore early, sometimes within hours of landing. These machines carved trenches, built revetments, and flattened firing lanes at a pace no manual labor could match. Seabees and combat engineers worked with brutal efficiency. They operated at night. They worked under sporadic fire. They repaired machines as fast as they broke. Where jungle resisted, machines overruled it. Prefabrication also played a role. Timber supports, sandbags, and standardized construction techniques meant positions could be reinforced quickly. Nothing was ornamental. Everything served function. This was industrial thinking applied to survival. Japanese observers mistook these works for permanence. Trenches that looked like weeks of labor had sometimes been completed in a single night. What appeared to be a fortress was often only days old. Yet it held. The battlefield itself had become mechanized. And in that transformation, human effort amplified by tools and machines, the Americans gained something invisible but decisive, time compressed into hours instead of days. The shock felt by Japanese troops was not dramatic or emotional. It was professional, and it was documented. After early encounters with American positions in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, Japanese field reports began noting an unexpected pattern. Enemy defenses, once located, did not crumble under pressure. Trenches appeared deep and well-constructed, even when contact had been recent. Machine gun fire emerged from positions that seemed newly cut yet expertly sighted. Some reports expressed confusion over speed. Japanese officers wrote of advancing against positions that reconnaissance had identified only days earlier as lightly held or even empty. By the time assault units moved, those same areas had become layered defensive zones. Assault timetables no longer aligned with reality. This forced adjustments on the ground. Night attacks were pushed harder. Artillery preparation was increased where possible. Yet even then, American positions absorbed punishment better than expected. The surprise was not that Americans defended. It was that they defended immediately. Japanese infantry had long relied on catching enemies mid-transition, landing, regrouping, hesitating. Instead, they found men already below ground, already aligned, already prepared to endure. In a doctrine built around momentum, this was disorienting. Momentum requires fragility on the other side. The Americans offered none. American commanders did not micromanage trench lines. They enabled them. At battalion and regimental levels, officers emphasized preparation as a command responsibility. Orders often included not just objectives, but instructions to fortify immediately upon reaching them. Engineers were assigned forward. Equipment was prioritized accordingly. Commanders like Alexander van der Grift on Guadalcanal understood that holding ground mattered more than advancing it. Airfields, supply routes, and defensive perimeters became anchors. Every yard held was a yard reinforced. This leadership philosophy encouraged initiative. Platoon leaders were trusted to improve positions without waiting. Engineers were encouraged to adapt plans based on terrain. If a ridge offered better protection than a road, it was shaped accordingly. This flexibility contrasted sharply with Japanese command structures, which often emphasized adherence to plan over adaptation to conditions. American commanders accepted that plans would change and designed doctrine around that reality. The result was a battlefield that evolved constantly in favor of the defender. For Japanese soldiers, time traditionally favored the attacker. Delay was dangerous. Hesitation invited defeat. American doctrine inverted that belief. Every minute spent not attacking was a minute used to prepare. Every pause deepened trenches. Every night strengthened positions. Time did not weaken American resolve. It reinforced it. This had psychological consequences. Japanese troops attacking American lines encountered a sense of inevitability. Fire came from unseen angles. Explosions failed to silence positions permanently. Even after heavy bombardment, defenders reappeared. The ground seemed alive. This eroded morale not through fear, but through frustration. Assaults that should have succeeded did not. Casualties mounted without visible progress. Reports back to headquarters became cautious, then concerned. Time, once an ally, had turned hostile. And as Japanese commanders struggled to restore momentum, American positions continued to harden, quietly, methodically, until the moment arrived when preparation met pressure head-on. That moment, the point where speed, surprise, and doctrine collided with prepared earth, would not come slowly. It would arrive in a single decisive clash where the value of minutes and the cost of miscalculation became unmistakably clear. October 24th, 1942. Guadalcanal, the perimeter south of Henderson Field. Rain had fallen most of the night, turning the ground into a slick mixture of mud and torn vegetation. Japanese forces under Lieutenant General Harakichi Hayakitake were already in motion. After weeks of failed probes and costly skirmishes, this was meant to be decisive. The plan relied on speed. Japanese infantry would advance through jungle corridors, strike American positions at night, and break the defensive line before artillery and air power could intervene. The assumption was familiar. Americans would be thin, exposed, still vulnerable. They were not. As the first assault waves closed in, they encountered silence, then fire precise and overlapping. Machine guns opened from trenches dug deep into the earth. Mortars answered from concealed pits. Rifle fire came not from a line, but from depth. The ground itself absorbed the initial shock. Japanese troops advanced into what should have been temporary defenses and found instead positions that endured bombardment. Shells burst above trenches, scattering dirt but failing to neutralize defenders. Men rose from cover moments later, firing calmly, systematically. The attackers pressed forward anyway. Units closed the distance, attempting to breach with grenades and bayonets. But the trenches were deeper than expected. Firing steps allowed defenders to engage without exposing themselves. Secondary positions activated when forward foxholes were hit. Hours passed. Momentum bled away. American positions, shaped over days and nights of relentless digging, functioned exactly as intended. They slowed the attack. They disrupted coordination. They forced Japanese units to bunch together in kill zones already registered by artillery. By dawn, the ground in front of the lines was marked by the cost of miscalculation. This was not a battle won by superior numbers or sudden maneuver. It was decided by preparation, by the quiet labor of men who had turned minutes into meters of protection. And as Japanese commanders assessed the situation, it became clear that something fundamental had changed. The enemy they faced was no longer reacting. It was waiting. The full weight of that realization would only strike after the next assault, when even greater effort met the same unyielding earth. The second assault came before the lessons of the first could be fully understood. Japanese commanders, convinced that spirit and persistence could still overcome resistance, ordered renewed attacks along the perimeter. Reinforcements were fed forward. Artillery fired what ammunition it could spare. Night again was chosen as the ally that would restore surprise. But surprise no longer existed. American positions had not only held, they had improved. Damaged trenches were deepened. Collapsed walls were reinforced with timber and sandbags. Engineers worked through the night, even as flares arced overhead and small arms fire crackled in the distance. When the next Japanese waves advanced, they found defenses even more resilient than before. Attacks dissolved into confusion. Units lost alignment in jungle corridors already mapped by defenders. Machine gun fire swept approaches that had been cleared and prepared in advance. Mortars adjusted quickly, guided by observers protected below ground. Japanese soldiers fought with determination. They closed distances that should have been impossible. In places, they reached the trenches themselves. But even there, the design of the positions worked against them. Grenades detonated in some pits. Traverses blocked blast. Fire continued from adjacent positions. The earth refused to yield. By the end of the second night, the reality could no longer be ignored. Assault units were exhausted. Casualties were heavy. Supply lines struggled to keep pace. The American perimeter remained intact. Japanese reports from this period reflect a shift in tone. Confidence gave way to urgency. The enemy was described as firmly entrenched and difficult to dislodge. Time, once assumed to favor the attacker, had instead fortified the defense. This was the turning point, not because the battle ended that night, but because the assumptions that shaped Japanese operations began to collapse. Speed alone was no longer decisive. Courage alone was no longer enough. The battlefield had been transformed. American commanders recognized it immediately. They ordered continued improvement of positions, even as offensive plans were considered. The perimeter was not just a line, it was a system, a living structure that absorbed pressure and returned fire. For Japanese forces, the failure forced a reckoning. Continued assaults promised only further loss. Withdrawal and reorganization became unavoidable. What had begun as shock became understanding. The Americans had not merely dug trenches. They had redefined the terms of engagement. By reshaping the ground faster than the attacker could adapt, they had turned preparation into a decisive force. And as the fighting subsided, the consequences of that realization would spread far beyond Guadalcanal, reshaping how both sides approached every battle that followed. The war would go on, but the cost of ignoring the ground had now been written clearly into the soil, its aftermath measured not just in casualties, but in doctrine itself. When the fighting around the American perimeter finally subsided, the silence revealed what the assaults had failed to achieve. The ground remained held. For Japanese forces, the cost was immediate and measurable. Assault units that had gone forward expecting a breakthrough returned diminished, exhausted, and short of ammunition. Casualties mounted not in sweeping charges, but in repeated, grinding attempts to cross prepared fire zones. Entire battalions lost cohesion under fire they could not suppress. American losses, while real and painful, told a different story. Trenches had done their work. Fragmentation wounds replaced fatal ones. Units rotated through positions rather than collapsing under pressure. Medical evacuation functioned because command posts and aid stations had been dug deep enough to survive bombardment. Reports from the period reflect this disparity. American after-action assessments repeatedly credited field fortifications with preserving combat effectiveness. Japanese reports, by contrast, emphasized the unexpected resilience of enemy defenses and the difficulty of achieving surprise. This shift influenced immediate operational decisions. Japanese commanders, recognizing that further frontal assaults would be unsustainable, began to reconsider priorities. Efforts shifted toward harassment, artillery fire, and attempts to isolate positions rather than overrun them outright. Yet even these measures struggled against entrenched defenses supported by growing American logistics. For American forces, confidence in doctrine hardened alongside the trenches. Units arriving later studied the ground and understood its value instantly. Digging was no longer just habit. It was proof of survival. The psychological impact extended beyond the front lines. Japanese soldiers who had once expected swift engagements now anticipated prolonged resistance. Assault planning became more cautious. Reconnaissance increased. But time, the one resource Japan could least afford to lose, slipped away. Meanwhile, American engineers continued their work. Positions expanded outward. Airfields were reinforced. Supply routes were protected by earthworks. What had begun as defensive necessity became strategic advantage. The battlefield no longer reset between engagements. Each day built upon the last. This asymmetry, one side losing strength with time, the other gaining it, marked a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. It was no longer about who struck first. It was about who endured. And as the weeks turned into months, the consequences of that endurance would echo far beyond a single island, shaping the course of campaigns yet to come. The shock that began at the edge of American trenches did not remain there. It traveled through reports, through commanders, through the slow and painful process of adaptation. For the Imperial Japanese Army, the realization came too late to reverse the tide, but not too late to force change. Defensive doctrine began to evolve. On later islands, Japanese forces abandoned the idea of holding beaches or relying on rapid counterattacks. Instead, they dug deeply, deliberately, and often invisibly. On places like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Japanese fortifications became extensive, layered, and subterranean. Tunnels replaced trenches. Defense replaced maneuver. This shift was not philosophical, it was forced. The earlier assumption that enemies would remain exposed had been disproven at great cost. Yet these adaptations carried their own consequences. Deep defenses conceded the initiative entirely. They acknowledged that time now favored American firepower and logistics. They delayed defeat, but could not prevent it. American forces, meanwhile, refined what had already worked. Combat engineers became central to planning. Bulldozers landed with assault waves. Defensive construction timelines were shortened even further. Training emphasized digging as instinct, not instruction. By Okinawa, entire landscapes were reshaped within days. Hills were cut down. Roads were carved through rock. Defensive lines appeared almost as fast as units arrived. What had once shocked Japanese observers had become standard practice. The moral dimension of this shift was stark. Battles grew longer. Casualties increased. The earth absorbed violence, but it also prolonged it. Prepared defenses meant fewer sudden collapses, but more sustained destruction. Still, the lesson remained clear. In the Pacific War, the side that mastered the ground mastered survival. American commanders understood this. They planned accordingly. Operations were timed not just to seize objectives, but to prepare them. Air superiority and naval gunfire mattered. But without trenches, they meant little to the man on the ground. By the war's final year, the speed at which Americans could dig, fortify, and adapt had become part of their strategic identity. It was no longer remarkable. It was expected. What had once been a shock to Japanese troops watching from the tree line had evolved into a defining feature of modern warfare. The battlefield was no longer static. It was engineered, and in that transformation, quiet, relentless, and carved into the earth, the meaning of victory itself began to change, inviting reflection on what this moment truly represented. The trenches on Guadalcanal were more than just earth and timber. They were a statement, a demonstration that preparation, patience, and methodical effort could shape the fate of men on the battlefield. In those deep cuts and reinforced walls, the Americans turned time into a weapon, slowing an enemy who had long relied on speed and audacity. For the Japanese soldier watching from the tree line, the lesson was immediate. Courage alone was insufficient. Spirit, discipline, and shot could win battles, but only when the terrain allowed it. Against an opponent who bent the earth to his will, momentum faltered and doctrine met its limits. For the Americans, the trenches embodied a philosophy that would define the Pacific War. They showed that industrialized warfare was not just about firepower and numbers. It was about systems, preparation, and adaptation. Every shovel stroke, every bulldozer pass, every revetment built under rain or fire became part of a larger narrative, that survival and success often depended on the quiet, unglamorous labor of shaping the ground beneath one's feet. Beyond tactics, these moments illuminate a broader truth of war. Battles are not won solely through heroism or aggression. They are often decided by understanding and mastering the environment. Where the Japanese had once assumed vulnerability, the Americans created security. Where the Japanese had expected hesitation, the Americans imposed resilience. In a broader sweep of history, these trenches marked a shift in how warfare would be understood in the Pacific. They were early proof that engineering, preparation, and logistics could outmatch speed, aggression, and tradition. They reshaped not just the soil, but strategy, morale, and doctrine. And in that transformation, there's a quiet human story. Men laboring under fire, machinery carving paths through jungle, and leadership trusting preparation over recklessness. Together, they created a moment where the earth itself fought alongside them. In the end, Guadalcanal's trenches remind us that in war, as in life, mastery of time and terrain can turn the simplest tools into instruments of survival, and even into weapons that change the course of history.